Hi everyone, welcome to Mountain Home Stories. I hope you have been reading along with me. I've been reading The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. If you all haven't read the earlier two episodes, it's there in my channel. Look into those videos, y'all can hear those stories first. This is actually a Gothic horror story by Robert Louis Stevenson, and today I'm going to start with the third episode of it. I'm sure y'all are looking forward to it if y'all have heard the previous two episodes. So let's get on to it. And a gentle reminder, if you're new to my channel, please do consider subscribing to it. Now, without any further delay, let's just jump into the third episode. Incident at the window. The next Sunday, Mr. Utterson was on a walk, as he usually was wont to. He was enjoying the company of Mr. Enfield. They happened to be walking past the same lane where we first saw them. By and by, they reached the strange door where Mr. Utterson had accosted Mr. Hyde. The two men stopped there and began to look at it. Mr. Enfield was the first to speak. He said, with relief, that the story had come to an end at last. They would never again see the mysterious Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson was relieved to hear that. He said he hoped Mr. Enfield was correct in his prediction. Then he asked Mr. Enfield if he had ever told the latter that he had once seen him. Like Mr. Enfield, he, too, had felt disgusted by Mr. Hyde. Mr. Enfield pointed out that it was impossible to meet Mr. Hyde and not feel revulsion. Mr. Enfield then made a strange comment. He said that he believed now that Mr. Utterson would have thought he was not very bright because Mr. Enfield had not known that the strange door was the rare entrance to Dr. Jekyll's house. Mr. Enfield had come upon this startling information because of something Mr. Utterson had done. Mr. Utterson noted that not just he, but now his friend Mr. Enfield had also figured out that the strange door and the wall with no windows on the ground floor was actually the back of Mr. Jekyll's house. Since they both now knew this truth, he thought it fair that both of them should walk into the courtyard and observe the windows of the house. Mr. Utterson added that he was not comfortable about the condition of the unfortunate Dr. Jekyll. He was sure that a visit from a friend would bring him some cheer. The two men stepped into the courtyard. It was damp and so a little chilly in there. Surrounded, as it was, by high walls, there was very little sunlight that could enter the space and bring with it the cheer that light does. So, although the sky outside was still bright and there was some time before darkness, inside the light was fading. It was as if twilight had entered this courtyard before it ought to have. There were 3 windows ahead of them. The one in the center was open, although only half. Sitting at the window, as if to give himself some fresh air in an otherwise stale existence, was Dr. Jekyll. He looked very sad and his face was drawn. Mr. Utterson could not help but think that Dr. Jekyll reminded him of a prisoner sitting in his cell, only this man was a miserable prisoner in his own home. "How is Dr. Jekyll?" Mr. Utterson called out to Dr. Jekyll. He said he hoped that his friend was feeling better. Dr. Jekyll told Mr. Utterson that he was miserable. The only good thing that he could thank God for, he said, was that it would soon be over. Mr. Utterson replied that one reason for feeling so low was that Dr. Jekyll stayed only at home. He ought to come out a bit to get his blood coursing in his veins again, just like he and his friend were doing. He introduced Mr. Enfield as his cousin. Then he invited Dr. Jekyll to put on his hat and come out for a brisk little walk with them. Dr. Jekyll sighed. He observed that Mr. Utterson was a good person, and although he would not mind taking a walk, it was impossible for him to come out. Indeed, he did not dare come out. He said he was extremely happy to see both Mr. Utterson and Mr. Enfield and would have invited them to come into the house, but the house was in a sorry state and not fit to welcome visitors. Mr. Utterson, a kind man at heart, believed it would be best for them to continue to speak, as they had been doing, from the courtyard, with Dr. Jekyll by the window. Apparently, that was an arrangement that suited Dr. Jekyll also, who smiled at the suggestion. But he had barely spoken when the smile vanished as if someone had wiped it off his face. In its place, he suddenly wore a look of wretched fear and hopelessness. The change in his demeanor was frightening to the 2 men standing below and watching. There was just an instant during which they could catch that expression, because in a trice the window was shut. But that momentary hint of what Dr. Jekyll was suffering sent a shiver down their spines. They left the courtyard the way they had come, but did not exchange a word, either with Dr. Jekyll or with each other. They walked silently for some time, till they had crossed the lane. They came onto a busy road where there was some vehicular and human traffic. Finally, Mr. Utterson found the courage to look at Mr. Enfield. If anyone had been observing them, they would have noticed that both men had turned ashen. Although they had not spoken, their eyes were filled with terror. Mr. Utterson was the first to speak. He hoped that God would forgive them. Mr. Enfield could only nod. The two men continued to walk back without exchanging any words. The last night. Rather late one evening, Mr. Utterson was sitting in his house by a crackling fire. He had had dinner. He had a surprise visitor. It was Mr. Poole. He looked strained and tense. When Mr. Utterson asked him if something had gone wrong, Mr. Poole affirmed that something had indeed gone wrong. Mr. Utterson wondered if his friend, Dr. Jekyll, had taken ill. Mr. Utterson, a kind host, offered him a seat and handed a glass of wine to Mr. Poole to calm his nerves. He assured Mr. Poole that he could take his time and be frank with the lawyer. Mr. Poole reminded him of Dr. Jekyll's habit of cloistering himself in one room. Mr. Poole did not like what was happening and was really afraid. So concerned was he about what was happening that he wished he was not alive to see what he was witness to. Mr. Utterson could not understand exactly what Mr. Poole meant, so he asked him what frightened him so much. Mr. Poole carried on as if he had not heard Mr. Utterson's question. He said this fear had gripped him for about a week and he had come to the end of his tolerance. He looked just as scared as he sounded. He was behaving strangely and refused to meet the eye of Mr. Utterson. He looked away as he spoke. The only time he allowed their eyes to meet was when he mentioned how afraid he was. He did not take a sip of wine. The glass rested on his knee as he fixed his gaze on the floor. He kept saying that he could not take any more. Mr. Utterson assured Mr. Poole that he could comprehend that something must have really gone wrong and Mr. Poole should try to tell him what that was. When Mr. Poole finally spoke again, his voice was hoarse. He said he suspected something dishonest, unfair, and dishonorable. Mr. Utterson repeated the words, sounding very scared. He was also feeling irritable about his own reaction. He could not comprehend what Mr. Poole meant and asked him. But Mr. Poole said he dare not speak out. Instead, he requested Mr. Utterson to go with him so that he could see for himself. Mr. Utterson did not speak. Instead, he got up and fetched his hat and coat. He also could not help but note how reassured Mr. Poole was to know that he would go with him. Mr. Poole put the glass of wine down without taking a single sip and got ready to go out with Mr. Utterson. A cold night. They stepped out into a cold March night. The moon threw out a pale light. It was so windy they could barely speak. It was little wonder that the streets were almost deserted. Mr. Utterson could not remember seeing these streets so empty. Mr. Utterson was sorry there were so few people around. He would have felt better with a crowd around him. He could not help thinking some kind of catastrophe lay ahead of him. Mr. Poole had been walking a couple of steps ahead of Mr. Utterson. They reached the square, the trees lashed by the wind. Mr. Poole stopped in the center of the footpath. Mr. Utterson was sorry to note that although the night was so nippy, he was sweating. He swept his hat off and dabbed a red handkerchief along his sweaty brows. Although they had walked rather fast, Mr. Poole was not sweating. His face, white with fear, was wet with some unspeakable tension, and his voice broke when he spoke. He hoped nothing had gone wrong. Then he knocked gently on the door. Someone opened the door, but it was still latched on a chain from within. Someone asked from inside if it was Mr. Poole. When Mr. Poole confirmed it was indeed him, the door was opened. He entered the hall. It was bright and lit. There was a crackling fire on in the fireplace. All the servants had gathered around it, huddled, as if in fear. When she saw Mr. Utterson, the maid began to whimper. The cook ran up to hug him. Mr. Utterson was a little irritated to see them all collected in the hall. He pointed out that Mr. Jekyll would never approve of all of them collecting instead of working. Mr. Poole took up from his colleagues. He explained that they were all afraid. There were a few moments of silence, and then the maid began to cry loudly. Mr. Poole, already tense and nervous, shouted at her to keep quiet because her sudden and loud wail had made them all jump and look at the inner door. Requesting a candle from the knife boy, Mr. Poole asked Mr. Utterson to go with him to the garden at the back of the house. He requested him to be as silent as possible so that he could hear without being heard. He even warned him that Dr. Jekyll may ask him to go in, but he ought not to listen to him. That unexpected warning made Mr. Utterson very nervous. Into the laboratory. They entered the laboratory building and went to the staircase. Mr. Poole signalled to Mr. Utterson to move to one side and listen carefully. Mr. Poole put the candle down. Mustering up courage, he took the steps. When he reached the door covered with coarse red woolen cloth, he gave a hesitant knock. Then he announced to Dr. Jekyll that Mr. Utterson was there to meet him. Again, he gesticulated to Mr. Utterson to listen carefully. Someone spoke from inside, saying he was not seeing anyone. Thanking the person inside the room, Mr. Poole picked up the candle, walking back the way he had come, with Mr. Utterson following. They entered the huge kitchen. Nothing was being cooked there, and the stove was cold. Mr. Poole asked Mr. Utterson a strange question. Did he really believe that the voice from behind the closed door belonged to Dr. Jekyll? Mr. Utterson, trying to look very brave, admitted that the voice did sound different, but Mr. Poole noticed that the lawyer looked ashen. Mr. Poole continued discussing the voice. He said working for Dr. Jekyll for 20 years had made him sure about his master's voice. He believed that Dr. Jekyll had gone 8 days before that night, the day the staff heard him cry and pray. So, somebody else was there in that room, pretending to be Dr. Jekyll, although Mr. Poole could not comprehend why the person should be in that room, calling out for divine intervention. Mr. Utterson bit on his finger and admitted that the situation was extraordinary. But then again, it may not have been so improbable. What if Dr. Jekyll had been murdered? Would the murderer have stayed on so many days after committing the crime? The argument did not sound logical. Mr. Poole said he found Dr. Utterson difficult to reason with, but he would certainly be able to convince him soon. Mr. Poole tried another argument. For the past week, the owner of the voice had been crying all day and through the night, trying to recall the name of a medicine. Dr. Jekyll would sometimes write the names of medicines he wanted and throw the prescription on the staircase. All week, there had been none of that. All they had found were papers. The meals that they left at the door were sneaked in when no one was around. Several times a day, Mr. Poole was given orders and he would go to the chemist's. Whenever he brought in an order, it would be returned with a complaint and a suggestion to go to another chemist who had better chemicals. Mr. Poole finds a paper. Mr. Utterson asked if Mr. Poole still had many of the papers with him. Mr. Poole searched his pockets and came up with a creased paper. Mr. Utterson turned towards the light from the candle and studied the paper. Something was written on it. It was rather a long note from Dr. Jekyll to the chemist, reminding him of the same chemical that he had brought from them in the past and requesting the same pure quality. Mr. Utterson found it a weird note, but what he found more unusual was that Mr. Poole should have opened it. Mr. Poole had an explanation. He said he had not opened the note, but the chemist who read it was so angry that he threw the note at Mr. Poole. Mr. Utterson could endorse the handwriting. He told Mr. Poole that he was sure they were looking at Dr. Jekyll's handwriting. Mr. Poole agreed that the handwriting was the same, but the man he saw was certainly not Dr. Jekyll. Mr. Utterson wondered how Mr. Poole could have seen the man holed up in the room. Mr. Poole had a frightening explanation. One day he entered the house suddenly and unexpectedly from the garden. The man had probably not expected anyone at that time and had come out and was foraging in the room. What was he looking for? Some medicine? When he heard Mr. Poole enter, he looked up, cried out and ran up the stairs into the room, shutting the door behind him. Mr. Poole saw him for just about a minute, but that was enough for his hair to stand on end. The man was wearing a mask. Why would Dr. Jekyll do that? If he were the owner of the house, why did he howl and run away? Mr. Utterson began to make some sense of the situation. He explained to Mr. Poole that although it all looked strange, Dr. Jekyll was probably suffering from a disease that was painful and also made him look ugly, so he wore a mask. That is why he was looking desperately for a medicine. But Mr. Poole was not going to be convinced. He called the person he had seen that thing and noted that he was not as tall as Dr. Jekyll. This person was almost a dwarf. Mr. Poole pointed out several other details of Dr. Jekyll that he had picked up over the 20 years that he had been working with him. He was sure that Dr. Jekyll had been murdered. Checking the facts. Mr. Utterson said that such strong allegations meant he had to check the facts. The only way to do that would be to break the door down and enter the room. Mr. Poole was relieved to hear that. But Mr. Utterson wondered who would open the door. Mr. Poole had a ready answer. The two of them. Mr. Utterson assured Mr. Poole that he would try to do his best to see that no harm came to Mr. Poole for what he did. Mr. Poole picked up an axe and suggested the poker from the kitchen for the lawyer. He reminded Mr. Poole that they were putting themselves in some danger. Still, Mr. Utterson asked Mr. Poole if he recognized the masked man. Although Mr. Utterson did not mention any names, Mr. Poole knew what he meant. He did think it was Mr. Hyde. After all, Mr. Hyde had the key to the laboratory when the man was murdered with the cane. He asked Mr. Utterson if he had ever seen Mr. Hyde. When he heard that the two had met, he asked if Mr. Utterson had not noticed something odd about the man, something that made the blood run cold. Mr. Utterson agreed he had felt revulsion when he met Mr. Hyde. Mr. Poole recalled a similar dislike when he saw the masked man. Although that was not much of a proof, he was sure it was Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson agreed. He also suspected that Mr. Hyde was hiding in that room. And he was not surprised because he knew even before that nothing but bad could come out of Dr. Jekyll's association with Mr. Hyde. He also feared, like Mr. Poole did, that Dr. Jekyll had been killed by Mr. Hyde, who was still hiding in that room, pretending to be Dr. Jekyll. This demanded action on their part, and he decided that both Mr. Poole and he would avenge the death of Dr. Jekyll. He asked for Bradshaw, the footman. Bradshaw, when he did come, was obviously shaken. Mr. Utterson addressed Bradshaw and asked him to calm down. It was only understandable that the mystery of Dr. Jekyll's strange behavior would make the man nervous. But Mr. Utterson told him that they would soon end the suspense. He shared his plan with Bradshaw. Mr. Poole and Mr. Utterson were to force open the door to the chamber. Mr. Utterson believed he was strong enough to do it alone. If something went wrong, or if the criminal tried to escape through the laboratory door at the back, he would be accosted by Bradshaw and a boy armed with sturdy sticks. The attack was planned for 10 minutes after Bradshaw left. At the door, Mr. Utterson and Mr. Poole took their positions at the door to the chamber. He picked up the poker and walked into the yard. Clouds had drawn themselves across the moon, so the yard was dark. The candle in his hand flickered in the gusty wind. When they reached their destination, they sat down since they still had some time to kill. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of the city's activities. Inside, they could hear someone pacing up and down the room. Mr. Poole whispered to him, referring to the footsteps that were clearly audible, that the person inside paced the room all day and for most of the night. The only time the person stopped walking in the room was when he had to check a sample of chemicals from the chemist. It was obviously a troubled conscience, bothered surely by nothing short of murder. But Mr. Poole was sure that the footsteps were not Dr. Jekyll's. They were the steps of a lighter man, while Dr. Jekyll, of a big build, had a heavier step that made the footboards creak. Once, Mr. Poole had even heard the person cry. It was such a sad cry that Mr. Poole, who had left shortly, could have burst into tears too. The 10 minutes were over. Bradshaw and the boy would have taken their places. Mr. Poole took out an axe from under a sack of straw. They placed the candle on the table closest to the door and inched up to the door. Mr. Utterson called out to Dr. Jekyll. He demanded that he come out. There was no reply. Mr. Utterson threatened he would use force if needed to see Dr. Jekyll. Someone from inside the room addressed Mr. Utterson and begged for his sympathy. Mr. Utterson recognized the voice as that of Mr. Hyde and said so. Then he shouted out an order to Mr. Poole to break down the door. Mr. Poole swung the axe at the door so hard the house shook. The door strained against the hinges. From inside the room came a strange screech like the howl of a terrified animal. Mr. Poole swung the axe 4 times, but the door was made of very good wood. It was only when he hit it the 5th time that the door caved in, falling on the carpet. Horrified. Mr. Poole and Mr. Utterson were horrified with what they had just done. The room was silent. The 2 attackers took a step back and looked into the room. A lamp flickered in the room. A fire was burning with a kettle on it. 1 or 2 drawers were open and some papers had been placed on the table. By the fire was a table ready for tea. In the middle of the room lay a man, crooked and bent and convulsing. Mr. Poole and Mr. Utterson entered the room quietly and turned the person on his back. They were looking into the face of Mr. Hyde. He was wearing Dr. Jekyll's clothes, and that was apparent because they were too large for him. He was almost dead, although his face twitched. In his hand was a something. The room was heavy with the air of some chemical. Mr. Utterson knew then that Edward Hyde had taken his own life. Mr. Utterson was sorry that they had reached too late, either to save the life of Mr. Hyde or to catch him alive and hand him over to the police for a trial. But they still had to find Dr. Jekyll. They began to examine this section of the house thoroughly, looking in the dark closets and even the cellar. The closets were empty and dusty, since they had not been opened in a long time. A lot of old wood lay dumped in the cellar, dating to the previous owner of the house. An old and elaborate cobweb at the entrance told them that the room had not been touched for a long while. So, where was Dr. Henry Jekyll? Was Dr. Jekyll dead? Mr. Poole had his suspicions. He struck the board in the passageway. He was sure that Dr. Jekyll had been buried under the boards. Mr. Utterson thought of another possibility. Dr. Jekyll could have escaped. If he had indeed made a getaway, he would have taken the rear door that led to the lane at the back of the house. The door was locked. The key was lying on the floor, rusted and unused in a good length of time. In fact, it had been broken on purpose. So, on Mr. Utterson's suggestion, they went back to the cabinet room, taking the stairs without a word. They spared the deceased very little attention and went on to study what was in the cupboard. They found a small chemical laboratory equipped with powders and glassware. It was almost as if the chemist had been stopped in the middle of the testing. Mr. Poole was the first to speak. He recognized the medicine as the one he had brought Dr. Jekyll often. The kettle, boiling for some time now, made a strange sound, and the water flowed out of the spout. The men went closer to the fire. Things looked as though someone was getting ready for a cozy tea session. Even the sugar was in a cup. A book, being read, was still open on the table. Mr. Utterson found a religious book Dr. Jekyll had often referred to with respect. When Mr. Utterson went through the book, he was surprised to find that Dr. Jekyll had made several notes on the sides, and the thoughts he had written were far from pious. As they rummaged through the room, they reached the dressing mirror. When they looked into it, they were disturbed by disconcerting thoughts. Although all they saw in it was the warm glow thrown on the roof by the fire and their own pale faces. Mr. Poole, speaking in a whisper, pointed out that the mirror had been witness to bizarre happenings. The most strange of all, he said, was the thought that Dr. Jekyll should require a dressing mirror in his laboratory. Papers speak volumes. Papers were neatly arranged on the study table. At the top of the pile was a big cover. Written on it, in Dr. Jekyll's handwriting, was the name of Mr. Utterson, who opened it. Some papers that were loose slipped onto the floor. One of these was a will, not very different in style and manner to the earlier will. It still mentioned the possibility of the death and the disappearance of Dr. Jekyll. The only noticeable difference, and one that surprised the reader, was that the benefactor was not Mr. Hyde, but Mr. Gabriel John Utterson. Mr. Utterson, stunned, looked from the will to Mr. Poole to the man lying dead. By now, Mr. Utterson was feeling faint. He could not help but note that for several days the will had lain with the man on the floor. No wonder he did not like Mr. Utterson, since he must have been Very angry to find that he had been done out of the final will of Dr. Jekyll, although he had been the sole benefactor in the first, which lay with Mr. Utterson. Yet he did not destroy the second will that went against his interest. The second paper that Mr. Utterson picked up was also a revelation. It was dated the same day and written by Dr. Jekyll. That meant he had been in that room that same day and he could not have been killed since there was hardly any time to dispose of a body before they broke open the door. We'll continue with the next part of the story in another video. Hope you're finding it interesting. Leave me a comment and let me know. Please do like and share, and of course subscribe to my channel if you're new to it. Hit on the notification bell for my next videos, and thank you so much for dropping by. Come back to hear me again. Till then, take care and bye-bye.